Welcome to my round 5 report on the Tata Steel chess tournament. Once again, we were spoilt for choice. There were so many exciting games today, but I thought I'd pick the encounter between Anish Giri, the coming man, just 20 years old and rated 7th in the world, playing against Baadur Jobava from Georgia. Now, so far, Baadur hasn't had much luck, but he always plays such entertaining chess, and I think it's high time that we featured one of his games. And he's never afraid to take the fight to his opponent, and that's what happened today. Giri, with the white pieces, played d4, and Jobava played the King's Indian, which is basically sends out a message. You're up for a fight. And Giri played the old main line, you could say, closing the centre with d5, and here he played perhaps the most aggressive continuation in this line, the most direct, b4, the so-called bayonet attack. White simply wants to play c5, attacking the pawn on d6 and opening up the c file as well. Now, there are a couple of ways of dealing with this. One is to play a5, and then you have to take this, and, well, this sends the game in quite a different direction. But white has already engaged black in a fight on the queen side, and, well, principled black players don't like to go in for this. Knight h5 is the most popular move, getting ready for the good old f-pawn to thrust down the board, and perhaps looking to put the knight in on f4 as well. This is the classic King's Indian move. And here one can play c5, you can also play g3, but rook e1 is quite a subtle continuation, and yeah, quite a popular move. After the knight comes into f4, now the bishop drops back to f1, so white takes a little bit of time, but just regroups very nicely. So the bishop is tucked out of the way, protecting the sensitive g2 square out of the range of the knight on f4, and the rook can also be very useful on the e file, supporting the e4 square. So here comes the f-pawn, f5, and now a4. One could play c5 here, but a4 has another idea in mind. I mean, a4 and possibly a5 is very useful to gain space on the queen side. But, well, there's another idea. We'll see what happens. h6. So Jobava continues his idea of expanding on the king side, a pawn storm against white's king. Knight d2. So this preempts g5 and g4. And also supports the e4 square, that's very important. So g5, black gains some space. And now here we see the point of a4. The rook just removes itself from the long diagonal. That's important because sometimes you can take this knight off, and then it's nice to get out of this potential pin and protect the knight. But also, let's just get the paint off the board. The rook looks across to the king side, and when black is attacking, it's very useful that the rook covers squares. So rook a3 I really like. Now black has a choice. You can take on e4 here, and perhaps play bishop f5, develop your queen side, perhaps make room for the queen to come to d7, and then maybe knight g6. Or you could even play knight f5 here and perhaps look at the d4 square. This is a fairly calm, or relatively calm, way to play the position, but instead Jobava just carries on the king side, g4. And now what happens over the next few moves? It's like a game of chicken. White continues up the queen side, and black continues up the king side. But do you know what? Jobava's the kind of guy, if you're playing a game of chicken with him, with cars racing at each other, you know, he's going to throw the steering wheel out the window. He's we know what's going to happen. He's never going to back down. He's such a direct player. c5. So they both continue with their expansion. Giri on the queen side, Jobava on the king side. Knight c4, the standard move, looking at the d6 pawn. Knight g6. And Giri takes and continues. He's not backing down either. So the knights attack the pawn on d6. This has to be protected. And now g3. So Giri would very much like to drive this knight away and then maybe take on f5. Well, sorry, I beg your pardon. If the knight, for example, comes here, then here's the problem. Bishop g5. There's this terrible pin, and after that, d6 collapses. So this is the problem. Basically, the knight cannot move in this position. First of all, Jobava took on g3. Giri thought for a little bit here, and well, he was obviously wondering about f takes g3. And in this case, because the second rank is open, then it's possible to defend a bit better on the king side. But he was worried at some point this diagonal could be open. Positionally, of course, you're supposed to take towards the centre. But, I mean, he said he looked at this variation. So white takes a piece and then comes back with the rook. But he was just kind of worried the king's a little bit exposed and black has some compensation here. But I think this ought to be very, very good for white. But instead he played h takes g3, and this is probably still good, but it's tricky now. Jobava played a6. So this is a crunch moment in the game. Black puts the question to the knight. Now, I was thinking at the time that it would be best just to crash through and then take the knight on f4. And Giri spent some time examining this position, but he wasn't absolutely sure. He's the exchange up, but, there are potential threats here with knight h4. Perhaps this bishop comes into the game. He wasn't quite sure how to control this situation. So instead he backed down. He was the first to back down. He played knight c3. Incidentally, my computer thinks that knight b6 is a good move here and recommends this crazy move, putting the knight on a7. A human would never consider this. I mean, maybe it's good, but trying to work that out is impossible. So, Giri backed down, but not Jobava. He threw his knight into h4, so now both knights are on prise. But what happens if these are taken? Well, first of all, let's look at this one. Knight f3, and then the rook goes over to h6, and mate is threatened, disastrous. Or if pawn takes knight here, then again rook h6, and suddenly queen h4 with a mating attack. It happens that quickly. And of course the knight wants to come in here, and perhaps rook h6 anyway. So Giri, under big pressure here, he thought for almost half an hour on one move here and came up with knight e2. So he's making sure that the rook can cover this square. So Jobava played knight f3 check. Well, really, there's a definite threat to take here. So black has to plunge in. Giri takes, he has to take. So now he is an exchange down. Sorry, if he takes like this, if Jobava takes like this, then this should be excellent for white. You're going to pick up this pawn here, and this looks great. So after the check, black has to take on e2 first. That's check, of course. So white recaptures. So black is a clear exchange up here, but Giri thought that he was probably okay here because this knight is still very active and his king is now secure, so he's got rid of these menacing knights. bishop h6, this looks like a sound move to exchange off this poor bishop. Now the knight comes in, and you can see that, yeah, black has problems developing these pieces on the queen side. In the meantime, white's king is now rock solid. Jobava exchanged off, this is all good, and played f4. Yeah, excellent, good move. So, you know, he wants at some point to bring this bishop into the game. But now Giri counterattacks. The rook comes to the open file next to the king, and rook h5. That makes room for the queen to come over. So now there's a threat to play rook h8, and Jobava defends. Now, a very interesting move from Giri. He plays queen h2, and this is almost like a waiting move, actually. And now, well, the best continuation for black is to exchange here and then play bishop g4. And this opens up white's king just a little bit. And probably with best play, this should be a draw. Because, let's say, after this, now you can see that white is vulnerable to checks on this side of the board. For example, after knight d7, a knight fork, but queen g6. Now this has to be calculated very carefully, but after this rook check and rook here, queen e4 check, this is actually a forced draw. If king h3 actually loses to rook g6, that's nasty. So the king has to go back, and now it's a perpetual check. There's no way out for the king, and so on. But Jobava played bishop g4 straight away. Now, he thought that after this exchange that this would lead to a draw. After this, for example. And now queen g6, and if rook h8 check, and once again this should be a draw. After this move and queen c2 check and queen h7, it's going to lead to a draw by perpetual check. So that's what Jobava was expecting in this position. But Giri comes up with a really unexpected move. King f3. Completely overlooked by Jobava, understandably, and it's a winning move. Jobava had to resign after this. So the king defends the pawn on e4, but also attacks the rook. If the rook goes back, then in this case the rook check on h8 is just winning the rook because e4 is protected. And apart from that, well, you can try and take this pawn, but we take the rook, and then, well, basically white is a piece up, and well, this check is rather important, and now rook f5. Otherwise rook f8 would have saved the day, but white picks up the pawn, and the same with g2, rook check, and now king f3 picks up the pawn. So yeah, what a neat winning move, very unexpected. So Giri resigned, Jobava resigned, Giri wins the game, I beg your pardon. So that meant that Giri has 3 points, Magnus Carlsen has 3 points. I wish I had more time to show you that game. Carlsen played a beautiful strategic game and outplayed Levon Aronian. At the top, actually, Ivanchuk still leads with 4 out of 5. He drew quite quickly with Ding, who has 3 points. And Wojtaszek has... No, I beg your pardon. Ding has 3.5 points. And Wojtaszek has 3.5 points. He outplayed Fabiano Caruana. And further down, Šarić lost to Radjabov. There we go. There's so much going on. I'm getting totally confused. But Ivanchuk still leads the tournament on his own.